Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a world that smelled faintly of incense, horse sweat, and whatever unfortunate bird was roasting in the kitchens of Topkapi Palace. Yes, it's time for the Ottoman Empire. Settle in. Dim the lights. Put your phone down, unless, of course, you're listening to me on your phone, in which case, don't. Just pretend you've put it down. Now, the Ottomans were one of those dynasties that seemed like they would last forever. They didn't, obviously, but they gave it a good shot. Over 6 centuries of elaborate robes, wars, endless palace intrigue, and at least one man with the title the Drunkard. Which is a bit like applying for your legacy to be embarrassment. And tonight we're going to talk about why you personally, dear listener, would not last a single day in the Ottoman Empire. Not because of wars or plague or anything quite so dramatic, but because palace life was a combination of suffocating rules, eccentric rulers, and the sort of family dysfunction that made the Borgias look like a cheerful dinner party. So let's float back. The first thing you'd need to survive is a tolerance for very elaborate titles. If you address the Sultan without running through the entire laundry list of his honorifics, you might as well start digging your own grave in the palace garden. A Sultan wasn't just the Sultan. Oh no! He was shadow of God on earth, protector of the holy cities, emperor of the 2 lands and lord of the 2 seas, and so on. Imagine trying to introduce him at a cocktail party. You'd be halfway through the name and the drinks would be warm. And this was a dynasty that took itself seriously. It had to. Because ruling a sprawling empire that stretched from Hungary to Arabia required a certain gravitas. And also, frankly, a certain level of paranoia. Which brings us neatly to succession. Now, you might think that in a monarchy, the whole point is that the eldest son takes the throne. Nice, simple, neat. The Ottomans looked at that system and said, absolutely not. For centuries, succession was settled by fratricide. Yes. As in, congratulations, you're the new sultan. Now go strangle your brothers with a silk cord before breakfast. Because of course you wouldn't want to spill royal blood on the palace carpets. That would be gauche. So your first morning in the Ottoman court might involve watching the new ruler's brothers being quietly removed. If you're sensitive, this is the moment you'd excuse yourself to the garden for some fresh air. If you're less sensitive, you might make a mental note never to have too many brothers. Now, let's drift to Sultan Mehmed III. He ascended the throne in 1595, and, naturally, he wanted to make sure no one challenged him. His solution? Having 19 of his brothers executed. Yes, 19. And if you're wondering how the palace managed this efficiently, the answer is, practice. By then, it was practically a family tradition. To make matters worse, this was carried out under the approving eye of his mother. Because Ottoman mothers had a very clear sense of priorities, the throne came first, actual children came second. Mehmed himself was not exactly a shining example of stability. He mostly let his mother and advisors run the empire, while he personally spent a lot of time sulking in the harem. This, by the way, was another reason you wouldn't last. The harem. Which wasn't, as 19th century Western imagination suggested, some kind of exotic playground. It was more like a highly competitive boarding school, except with more silk veils and much higher stakes. It was filled with women, many of them enslaved, all maneuvering for position, trying to secure their son's place in the line of succession. You would need an iron stomach, an endless supply of patience, and preferably the ability to feign innocence while plotting someone's quiet downfall. Let's pause here. If you're thinking, well, I'd just stay out of politics, no, you wouldn't. In the Ottoman Empire, politics came for you whether you liked it or not. Take Sultan Ibrahim I, better remembered as Ibrahim the Mad. He was locked away in the so-called cage for most of his youth. The cage was a set of palace apartments where princes were kept under what we might call extreme protective custody. The theory was simple: if you don't let the princes out, they can't stage rebellions. The downside, of course, was that being locked in a cage for most of your formative years tends not to produce emotionally stable monarchs. So when Ibrahim finally became sultan, he did not handle it well. He developed a fascination with obese women, once ordering his officials to find the fattest woman in the empire and deliver her to him. They did. Her name was Shekharpare, and she became one of his favorites. Ibrahim also liked to roll around in furs, like an overstimulated cat, and he once drowned 280 women from his harem because of a vague suspicion of disloyalty. This was not a man you'd want to make small talk with at dinner. Unless you wanted to end up face down in the Bosphorus. If all this sounds bleak, remember that the Ottoman court was also full of absurdities. Take Sultan Selim too. He's the one with the unfortunate nickname, Selim the Sot. His reign was largely orchestrated by his ministers, while Selim himself was more interested in drinking. And by drinking, I don't mean the occasional glass of wine at a banquet. I mean drinking to the point where his death was caused by, wait for it, slipping in the palace bath after being drunk. Which is a surprisingly undignified end for the supposed shadow of God on earth. Now, would you have survived under Selim's rule? Maybe. He wasn't the type to strangle his brothers himself, after all. But you'd have had to sit through endless evenings of him slurring into his goblet. Which, let's be honest, might be worse in the long term. And then there's the matter of food. You might think palace banquets were glamorous. They were not. Meals were heavy on stews, pilafs, and roasted meats, which is fine. But hygiene? Not always reliable. The palace kitchens employed thousands of people, but food poisoning was not exactly rare. Add to that the strict etiquette, you couldn't just grab a snack when you felt like it. No. You waited until the Sultan was served, and then you ate in careful silence. If you sneezed at the wrong moment, you'd better hope no one important noticed. Let's also remember the baths. The Ottomans loved them, which is great in theory. But you, dear modern listener, would not survive the etiquette of the hammam. There were rituals, schedules, and expectations. Imagine a world where missing your bath slot might insult a Grand Vizier. The stress alone could finish you. And finally, let's not forget the constant paranoia. Janissaries, the elite guards of the empire, were loyal, until they weren't. They had a habit of overthrowing sultans when things weren't going their way. Imagine trying to fall asleep at night knowing that the people outside your door were also the people most likely to drag you off the throne. Sweet dreams. The empire was magnificent from the outside, domes glittering in the sun, endless processions, silks and jewels. But inside, it was a pressure cooker. And unless you had nerves of steel, a talent for silent scheming, and a total disregard for your siblings' survival, you wouldn't last a day. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow, just be glad you weren't born into the Ottoman dynasty. Life is stressful enough without having to worry that your brother might strangle you before breakfast. And on that soft note, let's drift toward the next royal fiasco. Welcome back, everyone. Still awake? Hopefully not. But just in case you are, let's float quietly westward, out of Istanbul, across the patchwork fields of Europe, and into the lands of the Habsburgs. Now, the Habsburg dynasty is one of those families that seemed allergic to fresh blood. They married cousins. Then cousins of cousins. Then cousins who were, quite frankly, the same person twice on the family tree. If you've ever wondered what happens when your family tree is more like a family wreath, well, meet the Habsburgs. Their motto was "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." Which sounds romantic at first. Until you realize that what it really meant was, stop sending troops. Just marry your nieces into Spain until the entire continent belongs to you. Efficient? Yes. Healthy? Not at all. Let's begin with poor Charles II of Spain. He is the poster child, if the poster child had a jaw that made chewing nearly impossible. Charles was born in 1661, the product of centuries of marital recycling. His parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. Which is already not ideal. His grandparents were also alarmingly close relations. By the time Charles came along, the Habsburg family tree looked less like a tree and more like a single trunk with one wilting branch. Charles suffered from what's politely called mandibular prognathism, or more commonly, the Habsburg jaw. His lower jaw jutted out so far that closing his mouth was a constant struggle. Eating solid food was difficult. Speaking clearly was nearly impossible. He was sickly, weak, and often described by contemporaries as resembling some sort of confused mollusk. Naturally, they made him king. Now, Charles's reign was not exactly a roaring success. He could barely walk until he was 8. He never learned to read properly. His illnesses piled up: epileptic fits, digestive problems, infertility. And yet, this fragile man-child was expected to lead one of the largest empires in the world. Which, unsurprisingly, did not go well. His court spent most of its time arguing over who would succeed him, since everyone knew Charles himself wasn't going to manage it. He had 2 wives, neither of whom produced a child. Not for lack of trying. But the Habsburgs had reached the point where nature was, quite simply, tapping out. Charles's autopsy revealed he had the body of a man twice his age, testicles described as atrophied, and intestines filled with pus. A grim picture. Though, to be fair, his physicians probably didn't help. One of them once prescribed him powdered human skull as medicine. Because, of course, they did. You wouldn't last a day in Charles's court, because you'd spend the entire time trying not to stare at the jaw. And if you failed, you'd be exiled before you could blink. But Charles was hardly alone in his misery. The entire Habsburg dynasty was a parade of peculiarities. Take Maximilian I, one of the earlier Habsburg rulers, who established their European dominance. He was clever, ambitious, and also deeply obsessed with astrology. Maximilian consulted horoscopes for nearly every decision, including political alliances. Which is sort of like running an empire based entirely on your daily horoscope app. Or consider Rudolph II, who reigned as Holy Roman Emperor in the late 1500s. Rudolph was a collector of everything. He hoarded exotic animals, mechanical toys, alchemical instruments, and dubious relics. He also suffered from bouts of deep depression, paranoia, and what modern historians suspect might have been schizophrenia. He retreated into his collections, neglecting actual governance. At one point, he owned so many lions and tigers that his palace resembled more of a chaotic zoo than an imperial residence. And yet, in the middle of all this, he still found time to enforce the family policy of marrying very, very close relations. It's like they couldn't help themselves. Now, let's drift gently to the marriages themselves. You'd think royal weddings would be glamorous. For the Habsburgs, they were more like genetic experiments conducted in full public view. Take Philip II of Spain. He married 4 times. His first wife was his cousin. His second wife was his cousin once removed. His third wife was his niece. And his fourth wife was also his niece. At this point, the Spanish nobility probably just stopped bothering to draw proper family trees. It was assumed everyone was related anyway. The irony, of course, is that these marriages were meant to secure the dynasty. But they ended up destroying it. By the time Charles II took the throne, the inbreeding coefficient, the mathematical measure of how related your parents are, was higher than if his parents had been siblings. Which is not exactly an endorsement of dynastic strategy. Of course, not all Habsburg oddities were physical. Some were simply strange. Take Emperor Ferdinand I. He suffered from constant illness, speech impediments, and epilepsy. Yet he reigned for decades, mostly because the machinery of empire carried on around him while he struggled with basic functions. His motto was reportedly, "Let others wage war, you, happy Ferdinand, marry." Which might have been more of a family joke than an actual policy. And then there's Maria Theresa. She was one of the more competent Habsburg rulers, reigning in the 18th century. But even she wasn't free from the dynastic pattern. She gave birth to 16 children, many of whom were, predictably, married off to cousins and uncles. Her daughter, Marie Antoinette, would later discover that being married into the French royal family was less of a fairy tale and more of a slow-motion disaster. But that's for later. Let's drift back to Spain, though. Because Charles II deserves a bit more attention. People at the time called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. They genuinely believed he was cursed, because no one could imagine that simple inbreeding could produce such a fragile monarch. Exorcisms were attempted. Priests chanted over him. At one point, a nun was consulted to diagnose his condition. Unsurprisingly, none of this helped. Charles himself was, by most accounts, kind and gentle. but he was utterly incapable of ruling. Foreign ambassadors described him as imbecilic, childlike, and unable to make the simplest decisions. His death in 1700 marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg line, which meant that all those cousin marriages, all that careful dynastic engineering, had ended in a single exhausted man with no heir. The Spanish succession crisis that followed plunged Europe into years of war, which is a very Habsburg way to end things: quiet personal tragedy, followed by continent-wide chaos. Now, you may be thinking, alright, but maybe I could survive in this court. I'd just avoid staring at the jaw, avoid eating anything suspicious, and keep my head down. The problem is, you'd never manage to keep a straight face at dinner. Imagine sitting across from a monarch who struggles to chew, while courtiers pretend this is completely normal. One snicker, one raised eyebrow, and you'd be out the door. Possibly out the window. And let's not forget the illnesses. The Habsburgs passed along epilepsy, gout, depression, infertility, and a general tendency toward early death. Even if you survived the politics, the sheer atmosphere of hereditary sickness would wear you down. So, the Habsburgs, a dynasty that controlled vast territories, amassed immense wealth, and yet couldn't produce a healthy jawline if their lives depended on it. They remind us that power doesn't guarantee survival, and that sometimes, the mightiest empires are undone not by enemies, but by their own dinner table seating chart. So tonight, as you drift further into sleep, imagine yourself at a Habsburg banquet. The room is candlelit, the food is heavy, the conversation is slow. And across from you sits Charles II, blinking slowly, his jaw working against him, while courtiers nod solemnly, pretending this is all perfectly fine. Sweet dreams. And now, let's drift onward to our next royal disaster. Hey everyone. Still awake? Probably not, but if you are, let's drift softly across the Alps, away from the drooping Habsburg jawlines, and into the perfumed corridors of Versailles. French royalty is one of those topics that looks glamorous at first glance. Glittering mirrors, powdered wigs, fountains that sprayed water in unnecessary directions. But peel back the gilding, and you find an endless parade of fragile egos, petty rivalries, and kings who would have benefited from, well, therapy. Or at least a very stern nanny. Tonight, let's wander through some of the most melodramatic and slightly ridiculous kings France ever produced. Not the great military strategists or the visionary reformers, though those were few enough, but the ones who sulked, pouted, and insisted the sun revolved around them. Literally. Let's start with Louis XIV. The Sun King himself. He ruled France for 72 years, which is impressive. He outlasted nearly everyone around him. He outlasted his own hairline. He even outlasted good manners. Louis is often remembered for Versailles, the enormous palace he built just to remind everyone how important he was. Versailles was less of a home and more of a gigantic stage, where every moment of the king's day was a performance. Waking up, eating breakfast, even putting on his shoes, all of it was done in front of an audience. Imagine brushing your teeth in front of 24 courtiers nodding solemnly, as though your dental hygiene was a matter of state security. Louis genuinely believed he was the center of the universe. He called himself the Sun King, after all. And while he did actually achieve things, he centralized power, fought wars, expanded France, he also spent an alarming amount of time micromanaging etiquette. Courtiers at Versailles obsessed over who got to hand him his shirt in the morning. Which might sound silly, but was actually a big deal. If you were the one who handed Louis XIV his shirt, congratulations, you had political influence. If you weren't, better luck next reign. And yet, for all his grandeur, Louis was deeply insecure. He wore enormous wigs to cover his thinning hair. His shoes were custom-made to add a bit of height. And he surrounded himself with mirrors because he liked looking at himself. Versailles' famous Hall of Mirrors was basically the 17th century equivalent of an Instagram filter. Would you survive at Versailles? Probably not. The sheer level of pettiness would undo you. Imagine standing in a room for 6 hours, waiting for the king to eat a spoonful of soup, just so you could clap politely afterward. If you so much as yawned, your career was over. Let's drift to his great-grandson, Louis XV. Where Louis XIV was grand and imposing, Louis XV was distracted. He was nicknamed Louis the Well-Beloved, which was ironic, because by the end of his reign, almost nobody liked him. Louis XV inherited the throne as a child. He grew up in the same suffocating etiquette as his great-grandfather, and it did not do wonders for his personality. He had little interest in governing. Instead, he spent most of his time in the company of his mistresses. Which would have been fine, if he hadn't gone through quite so many of them. Madame de Pompadour, Madame du Barry, and a rotating cast of others. His court was less about policy and more about who was currently sharing his bed. His ministers tried to keep the country running, but Louis was prone to sudden whims. At one point, he gave away Canada to Britain after the 7 Years' War. Which, you know, is not the sort of thing you expect from someone nicknamed the Well-Beloved. Canadians have never forgiven him. The court at Versailles, under Louis XV, became a place of gossip and jealousy. Courtiers whispered endlessly about who had the king's ear, or more specifically, who had the king's pillow. If you tried to navigate that world, you'd either go mad or end up exiled to some miserable corner of the provinces. And then, of course, there's Louis XVI. The man who lost his head. Literally. Louis XVI wasn't a bad man, exactly. He was just profoundly unsuited to being king. He liked locks. As in, door locks, padlocks, complicated mechanisms. His idea of a good time was tinkering with metal in his workshop. Which would have been perfectly fine, if he'd been a village locksmith. Unfortunately, he was King of France. His wife, Marie Antoinette, gets most of the bad press. Let them eat cake, and all that. Which she didn't actually say. But Louis himself was hardly blameless. When the French people were starving, Louis was busy fiddling with keys. Literally. And when the revolution finally broke out, he vacillated endlessly, sometimes supporting reform, sometimes siding with reactionaries, mostly doing nothing at all. When he and Marie Antoinette tried to flee Paris, they were caught because he couldn't resist bringing a giant, slow-moving carriage full of luggage. Subtlety was not his strong suit. Imagine trying to survive under Louis XVI. You'd spend your entire time suppressing the urge to shout, "Just make a decision already." And then, eventually, you'd find yourself in the same line to the guillotine. Of course, French royalty wasn't all wigs and disasters. Sometimes it was also hygiene. Which is to say, there wasn't much. Versailles may have looked glamorous, but it smelled atrocious. Courtiers relieved themselves in hallways, gardens, and stairwells. Perfume was not a luxury, it was a necessity, because otherwise the stench would knock you flat. So not only would you have to survive the politics, you'd also have to survive the smell. Which, realistically, you wouldn't. And then there's the food. Banquets were endless, with dozens of courses. Which sounds lovely, until you realize that most of it was lukewarm by the time it reached the table, and nobody used forks properly. Court etiquette required you to eat slowly, in silence, while the king dictated the pace. Imagine waiting 20 minutes to take a bite of chicken, because the king had paused to admire his own reflection. The French court was full of little absurdities. Like Louis XIV's obsession with elaborate ballets, where he often danced in costume himself, portraying Apollo, the sun god. Because of course he did. Or Louis XV's decision to build a secret little house for himself at Versailles, where he could pretend to be a normal man. As though any normal man had a staff of hundreds preparing his simple dinners. And then, of course, Marie Antoinette's pretend peasant village, built so she could play at being a shepherdess. Nothing says I understand the common people like milking your pet cows in a silk gown, while servants hand you fresh milk on golden trays. So, would you last at the French court? No. Not unless you had the patience to endure endless gossip, the ability to ignore bad smells, and the willpower to keep a straight face while watching the king dance in tights. You'd either offend someone powerful, starve waiting for your next bite, or collapse from sheer boredom. The French monarchy eventually collapsed, too. Not just because of revolution, though that certainly did the trick. But because it was too wrapped up in its own pettiness to notice the world changing outside its gilded walls. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine yourself at Versailles. You're standing in the Hall of Mirrors. Candles flicker. Perfume hangs heavy in the air. the king is eating soup while dozens of courtiers watch with grave attention. And you are doing your very best not to yawn. Sweet dreams. And now, let's wander softly toward our next royal catastrophe. So, where were we? Yes. Tudor nurseries, those quiet, candlelit rooms filled with fine linen, heavy expectations, and far too many funerals. Because the truth is, the Tudors' children rarely made it past the cradle. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first queen, endured at least 6 pregnancies. Only one child, Mary, survived infancy. Imagine that, 5 tiny coffins before one child reached adulthood. And in those days, every failed pregnancy was not only grief, but political failure. Catherine was blamed. Whispered about. Some said God had cursed her. Others said it was her fault for marrying her late husband's brother first. Either way, her childbearing years were a chain of sorrow. Henry VIII's obsession with a male heir meant each child's survival carried national weight. The entire country waited, in anxious silence, to see if the baby cried, if the child grew. No pressure. Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife, gave him Edward, the longed-for prince. But she died of complications almost immediately. Edward entered life a living miracle, but also a reminder of his mother's death. Raised with the highest tutors and the deepest care, he was never allowed to forget that he was fragile. Always pale. Always coughing. He wrote earnest letters as a boy, full of theological zeal, but you can almost hear the strain in them. He wasn't made for ruling. And he wasn't made for living long. The Tudor daughters carried their scars differently. Mary grew up beloved, then illegitimate, then cautiously restored. Her childhood was a pendulum, one year the adored princess, the next a bastard stripped of her title, sent to live in reduced circumstances, sometimes forbidden from visiting her own mother. That leaves a mark. She grew into a woman of stern conviction, but also bitterness. Those flames she lit later, at Smithfield and elsewhere, might trace back to the coldness of her youth. Elizabeth's childhood was perhaps even stranger. Losing her mother at age 2, not to illness but to execution. That's not the sort of bedtime story you want to hear. She was shuffled into households, sometimes barely tolerated, always watched. A stepmother, Catherine Parr, gave her stability for a while, but even then Elizabeth was caught in dangerous situations, like being found in questionable encounters with Catherine's ambitious husband, Thomas Seymour. A teenager, already seen as both valuable and dangerous, she learned quickly to guard her words, to protect herself, to mistrust nearly everyone. It's no wonder Elizabeth mastered survival as queen. Her childhood was a rehearsal for paranoia. And then, we drift into the Stuart line. Because the Tudors left no heirs of their own blood, their cousin's family had to step in. The Stuarts of Scotland. James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, had a childhood that looked less like a royal upbringing and more like a horror story. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate when he was a baby. He grew up separated from her, shuffled between nobles who often used him as a bargaining chip. Some of his tutors were so strict that they terrified him into a permanent stammer. He became obsessed with witchcraft and plots. His nerves never recovered. His son, Charles I, grew up small, frail, stuttering, often sick. He was shy, withdrawn, awkward. Imagine being a little boy with weak ankles who had to wear boots reinforced with iron to help him walk, while everyone around you whispered that you might one day rule kingdoms. That combination, fragile body, fragile confidence, did not prepare him well for the throne. And, as you know, it all ended very badly indeed, with a block and an axe. Charles's children, too, bore the shadow of unhappy royal childhoods. His eldest son, the future Charles II, spent much of his youth in exile, dodging assassins and living in borrowed rooms in foreign courts. He learned wit, charm, and caution from sheer necessity. His brother James, later James II, absorbed the same lessons, though with less humor and more bitterness. So if Tudor childhoods were defined by death and dynastic anxiety, Stuart childhoods were shaped by exile and suspicion. And if you, dear listener, had been born into either family, you wouldn't have spent your days with toys and games. You'd spend them with tutors drilling Latin, servants whispering about politics, and parents either dead or distant. You'd grow up in a cage of silk, never safe, never free, always aware that your small body carried the weight of kingdoms. And with that, let's drift slowly toward another dynasty in our next part. Perhaps the Habsburg children, with their famously unfortunate bloodlines and jaws. Or maybe the Bourbons of France, whose princes were spoiled into uselessness before revolution swept it all away. Let's leave the cold English castles for a moment and drift south and east, into the sprawling empire of the Habsburgs. If Tudor childhoods were haunted by religion and executions, Habsburg nurseries were haunted by bloodlines. Or rather, by a lack of fresh bloodlines. Because the Habsburgs were famous for one thing above all, marrying their cousins. Over and over. And over. It made for some very complicated family trees. Picture a royal family album where half the portraits look eerily similar, with the same drooping eyes and jawlines. You'd think someone had just been lazy with the portraits, but no, it was genetic reality. Take poor Charles II of Spain, the most famous Habsburg child. Born in 1661, he inherited a kingdom and a face that looked, well, rather unfortunate. He had the Habsburg jaw to such an extreme degree that chewing food was difficult, and speaking was a constant struggle. As a child he was weak, delayed in walking, and plagued by illness. His tutors tried to mask it with pomp, but everyone knew the dynasty had produced a boy who was not exactly fit for kingship. He was called El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because people honestly thought he had been cursed. In reality, his frailty was the predictable result of generations of intermarriage. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were also cousins. The family tree was more of a circle. Imagine growing up as Charles, in a palace where every servant whispered about your weaknesses. Every illness sparked rumors of spells or demons. Every lesson left you exhausted. And yet, you were expected to rule a global empire. Childhood for him was less play and more waiting for the inevitable collapse. But Charles II was not the only Habsburg child to suffer. The family was full of sickly heirs, fragile little princes wrapped in silk but coughing in the night. Infant deaths were common. Heirs were rare. Every cradle felt like the last chance for the dynasty. Even before Charles, the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs had their share of tragedies. Ferdinand's children struggled with poor health. Emperor Leopold had buried many of his infants. The family celebrated births with fireworks, only to dress in mourning clothes weeks later. And all the while, the portraits kept showing the same long faces and heavy jaws. Generation after generation of children who looked like half-siblings, because in a way, they were. Now, you might ask, why did they keep doing this? Why marry cousins, nieces, even uncles? Well, dynastic logic. The Habsburg motto could have been, better in the family than in the enemies. They wanted to keep their empire intact. Which is to say, they traded the health of their children for the security of their borders. And their children paid the price. A Habsburg childhood, then, was often spent in sick rooms. Doctors prescribed leeches, herbal concoctions, and prayers. Priests hovered. Nannies tried to keep the children amused, but there's only so much fun to be had when your joints ache and your jaw can't quite close. Not all Habsburg children died young, of course. Some grew into adulthood and ruled vast lands. But even those who survived were often timid, sheltered, or ill-equipped. They were raised in rooms heavy with incense and paranoia, where the greatest danger wasn't assassination, but their own family's genetics. And if you, listener, had been born into a Habsburg cradle, you probably wouldn't have lasted long either. A cold in infancy might have turned to pneumonia. A fever might have taken you by winter. And if you somehow survived, you'd likely carry a crooked jaw, a weak stomach, and the permanent suspicion of curses following you from nursery to throne. So far, we've drifted through Tudor loss, Stuart exile, and Habsburg inbreeding. 3 dynasties. 3 very different ways of ruining a royal childhood. And yet, they all share the same lesson: a crown is a curse in disguise. In the next stretch, we might glide over to the Bourbons of France, those little princes raised in palaces of absurd luxury, so spoiled that when revolution came, they had no idea how to survive. So, picture Versailles. The chandeliers, the gardens, the mirrors stretching endlessly. the sound of fountains, of courtiers whispering. And in the center of it all, the royal children of France, raised not quite as humans, but as symbols. From the moment a Bourbon child was born, their life wasn't theirs. Take Louis XIV, the famous Sun King. As a child, he endured the Fronde, a civil uprising in France where mobs broke into the palace and terrified the young prince. He never forgot it. That childhood fear hardened him. It taught him that he must be untouchable, above everyone, divine. Which is why, when he grew up, he built Versailles as a golden prison for the nobility. A reminder, never let them get close again. But for most Bourbon children, the childhood lesson was the opposite, indulgence. They were swaddled in silk, surrounded by nurses, governesses, tutors, servants, priests, flatterers. You didn't dress yourself. You didn't feed yourself. You barely breathed without someone arranging it. Now, consider Louis XV's children. He had many daughters, called mesdames. They grew up in Versailles, always second class to their brothers, because France had a rule, no women on the throne. So these princesses spent their childhoods in a kind of elegant limbo. Educated, decorated, politely ignored. Some of them were married off late. Some never married at all. Imagine being a princess of the greatest court in Europe, and yet treated as decorative furniture. For the boys, it was even stranger. The Dauphins, the heirs, were raised like porcelain dolls. The royal nursery had dozens of attendants. Each act, feeding, changing clothes, even handing the child a toy, was ritualized, public, ceremonial. Privacy didn't exist. You were on stage from the cradle. And yet, survival was never guaranteed. Many heirs died young. Louis XIV buried most of his immediate heirs, his son, his grandsons, until only a frail great-grandson survived to inherit. The line of succession felt cursed, as if the grand palace itself consumed its children. Then came Louis XVI, awkward, shy, raised more like a country squire than a future king. His childhood didn't prepare him for rule. He preferred hunting and locksmithing to politics. He grew up under tutors who stressed piety but not much statecraft. So when the crown fell on his head, he was unready. A child who had never been allowed to make his own choices now had to make choices for millions. We know how that ended. And his own children, born to Marie Antoinette, were caught in tragedy. They spent their earliest years in Versailles, surrounded by extravagance, little silk outfits, miniature furniture, pet dogs and ponies. A childhood like a fairy tale. Until the revolution came. The royal family was arrested. The children were imprisoned in the Temple Tower. Marie Antoinette's young son, Louis Charles, was declared Louis XVII by royalists, though he was just 8. Revolutionary guards confined him in darkness, neglected him, abused him. He wasted away in a filthy cell, dying at age 10. A boy who had once played in golden gardens, now left alone in silence. His sister, Marie Therese, survived, but scarred for life. She lost her parents, her brother, her aunt. Her childhood ended behind prison bars. She later became known as the Orphan of the Temple. A title no royal child ever wanted. So, Bourbon childhood was a paradox. At first, a life so indulgent it barely seemed real, palaces, tutors, music, sweets. Then, in an instant, stripped of everything. From silk to rags. From being bowed to being spat on. If you'd been a Bourbon child, you'd probably have spent your early years believing the world was made of gold. And then, if you lived long enough, you'd learn that the world was sharper than any guillotine blade. And with that, we've drifted through Tudor trauma, Stuart exile, Habsburg genetics, and Bourbon indulgence. 4 dynasties. 4 flavors of childhood misery. Each unique. Each disastrous. In the next part, we might float gently into the Ottomans again, those sultans' sons raised in gilded cages, literally locked away until it was their turn to rule. Or we could slip toward the Romanovs' children, with their hemophilia, Rasputin, and imprisonment. The Ottoman dynasty had its own peculiar way of raising royal children. You might think, being born a son of the Sultan, you'd spend your childhood in splendor. golden cradles, silk cushions, fountains in the courtyard. And yes, that part was true. But the other truth was darker. See, succession in the Ottoman Empire was never neat. In earlier centuries, when a sultan died, his sons fought for the throne. Fought, as in, raised armies, besieged cities, killed each other. Sometimes, more than one prince died on the same battlefield. Sometimes, all but one were strangled. Eventually, the Ottomans decided this was a bit too chaotic. So they invented the kafes. The cage. Now, the word makes it sound like an iron prison, but it was more of a gilded confinement inside the palace. A suite of rooms, sealed off. Princes were kept there, under watch, with attendants and tutors, until it was their turn to inherit. So an Ottoman royal childhood could look like this. You're born with great ceremony, you're taught poetry, calligraphy, the Quran, maybe some archery in the garden. And then, you're quietly moved into the cage. For years. Sometimes for decades. Waiting. Imagine that. A child who grows into a teenager, then a man, without ever leaving the palace walls. No riding into the city, no campaigns, no freedom. Just embroidery, recitations, and endless suspicion. Some princes went mad. Others emerged timid, unfit to rule. A few emerged ruthless, determined to make up for lost time. But none emerged normal. For example, Sultan Mustafa I. He spent years in confinement before becoming sultan. His childhood in the cage left him unstable, prone to fits of melancholy. His reign was short, chaotic, and he was twice deposed. Or Sultan Ibrahim I, remembered as Ibrahim the Mad. His years in the cage left him paranoid, anxious, and obsessed. When he finally inherited, he indulged wildly, furs, women, extravagant hunts, until his behavior became too dangerous, and he too was deposed and executed. Childhood in the cage did not prepare you to be a sultan. It prepared you to survive boredom, paranoia, and isolation. Which meant that when you finally did inherit, you had no idea how to govern. And of course, every prince in the cage lived with a quiet, persistent fear, the bowstring. Because if you were judged too dangerous, or if your brother's throne needed securing, you might be strangled. Silently. At any age. So if you, dear listener, had been a child in the Ottoman dynasty, you would have learned very early not to trust the laughter of your playmates, nor the kindness of your attendants. You would have learned to sleep lightly, to avoid making enemies, to stay alive by being quiet. The palace, with its fountains and mosaics, would have felt less like a paradise and more like a waiting room for doom. So now, we've seen childhoods in England, Spain, France, Austria, and the Ottoman world. Different palaces, different languages, but the same themes: fragility, fear, and futures already stolen before they began. In our next drifting step, we might slip into the Romanovs' children, perhaps the saddest of them all, with their hemophilia, their dependence on Rasputin, and their final imprisonment. The Romanovs ruled Russia with crowns heavier than they looked, and their children carried the same weight, even in the nursery. You might picture them skating in St. Petersburg, bundled in furs, or playing in the gardens of Tsarskoye Selo. And yes, they did. But under the laughter, their childhoods were stitched with fragility, secrecy, and doom. Let's begin with the last Romanovs. Nicholas II, the final Tsar, and his wife Alexandra. They had 4 daughters, the Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. And then, after years of waiting, one son, Alexei. The heir. The hope of the dynasty. Alexei was born in 1904, and immediately, everything looked perfect. A healthy boy, fair hair, big eyes. The court rejoiced. Except within months, it became clear he was not healthy at all. He had hemophilia, the so-called royal disease. It was inherited through Queen Victoria's bloodline, because of course it was, and it made every bump, every fall, potentially fatal. If Alexei scraped his knee, he might bleed for days. If he stumbled on the stairs, he might bleed internally. The little boy who should have been raised to rule the empire instead lived like a porcelain figurine. His childhood was careful, painfully careful. No running, no rough games, no normal freedom. His sisters became his protectors, walking gently beside him, distracting him when he was in pain. The entire palace revolved around avoiding accidents. And when the accidents inevitably came, as they always did with children, the household spiraled into despair. Servants whispered. Doctors admitted they could do little. And Alexandra, the empress, wept. It was in this desperation that Rasputin entered the family. The holy man with a stare like a wolf and manners like a drunk in a tavern. He had no medical training. He smelled bad. He was coarse. But when he prayed by Alexei's bedside, the boy's bleeding seemed to slow. Modern historians suggest it wasn't mysticism but timing, and perhaps Rasputin's advice to stop harmful medications. But to Alexandra, it felt like a miracle. So Rasputin became not only Alexei's healer, but the family's shadow. A man whose presence shaped the Romanov children's lives just as much as their parents. Now, what about the sisters? Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Their childhood looked privileged on the surface. Education in languages and music. Silken dresses. Long walks in the palace gardens. But in practice, they lived in isolation. Alexandra, their mother, was deeply protective. She kept them apart from much of society. They slept on hard camp beds. Their rooms were simply decorated, almost austere. Alexandra believed hardship would make them strong. Ironically, it mostly made them lonely. And they weren't allowed to pursue romance freely either. Their marriages would be arranged, their futures dictated by politics. Olga, the eldest, was once considered for a European prince. Tatiana, admired for her beauty, was whispered about as a possible queen somewhere abroad. But as their father's reign collapsed, all such plans withered away. The girls grew into young women without real freedom, bound by their mother's anxieties and their brother's fragility. Anastasia, the youngest, was the mischievous one. Climbing trees, teasing guards, even hiding under tables to scare guests. But even her spirit was dulled by confinement as the empire unraveled. And of course, the end came in 1918, in the basement at Ekaterinburg. The children were told they were being moved. They dressed in their plainest clothes. Alexei, frail, had to be carried. And then, instead of a new palace, they faced executioners. It was a brutal end, one I won't linger on, since we're drifting into sleep. But what matters here is that all those careful years, the guarded games, the hushed voices around Alexei's illness, the long isolation of the sisters, ended not in crowns or marriages, but in silence. The Romanov children, fragile and cloistered, lived lives that were both protected and fatally exposed. They had everything, and nothing at all. So if you imagine yourself as a child in the Romanov palace, it might feel like this, layers of velvet and fur, but always a sense that your body could betray you. A world of tutors and prayers, but no friends outside your sisters. And the knowledge, however faint, that your life was tied to forces you could not control, illness, revolution, the mistakes of parents, and the whims of fate. Not exactly the winter fairy tale people imagine when they think of Russia's imperial children. Now, from the icy palaces of the Romanovs, where would you like me to drift next? I could carry us gently into the Habsburg children, with their famously inbred jaws and their heavy destinies. Or perhaps into the sad little Spanish infantes, many of whom never made it past infancy. The Romanovs ruled Russia with crowns heavier than they looked, and their children carried the same weight, even in the nursery. You might picture them skating in St. Petersburg, bundled in furs, or playing in the gardens of Tsarskoye Selo. And yes, they did. But under the laughter, their childhoods were stitched with fragility, secrecy, and doom. Let's begin with the last Romanovs. Nicholas II, the final Tsar, and his wife Alexandra. They had 4 daughters, the Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. And then, after years of waiting, one son, Alexei. The heir. The hope of the dynasty. Alexei was born in 1904, and immediately, everything looked perfect. A healthy boy, fair hair, big eyes. The court rejoiced. Except within months, it became clear he was not healthy at all. He had hemophilia, the so-called royal disease. It was inherited through Queen Victoria's bloodline, because of course it was, and it made every bump, every fall, potentially fatal. If Alexei scraped his knee, he might bleed for days. If he stumbled on the stairs, he might bleed internally. The little boy who should have been raised to rule the empire instead lived like a porcelain figurine. His childhood was careful, painfully careful. No running, no rough games, no normal freedom. His sisters became his protectors, walking gently beside him, distracting him when he was in pain. The entire palace revolved around avoiding accidents. And when the accidents inevitably came, as they always did with children, the household spiraled into despair. Servants whispered. Doctors admitted they could do little. And Alexandra, the empress, wept. It was in this desperation that Rasputin entered the family. The holy man with a stare like a wolf and manners like a drunk in a tavern. He had no medical training. He smelled bad. He was coarse. But when he prayed by Alexei's bedside, the boy's bleeding seemed to slow. Modern historians suggest it wasn't mysticism but timing, and perhaps Rasputin's advice to stop harmful medications. But to Alexandra, it felt like a miracle. So Rasputin became not only Alexei's healer, but the family's shadow. A man whose presence shaped the Romanov children's lives just as much as their parents. Now, what about the sisters? Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Their childhood looked privileged on the surface. Education in languages and music. Silken dresses. Long walks in the palace gardens. But in practice, they lived in isolation. Alexandra, their mother, was deeply protective. She kept them apart from much of society. They slept on hard camp beds. Their rooms were simply decorated, almost austere. Alexandra believed hardship would make them strong. Ironically, it mostly made them lonely. And they weren't allowed to pursue romance freely either. Their marriages would be arranged, their futures dictated by politics. Olga, the eldest, was once considered for a European prince. Tatiana, admired for her beauty, was whispered about as a possible queen somewhere abroad. But as their father's reign collapsed, all such plans withered away. The girls grew into young women without real freedom, bound by their mother's anxieties and their brother's fragility. Anastasia, the youngest, was the mischievous one. Climbing trees, teasing guards, even hiding under tables to scare guests. But even her spirit was dulled by confinement as the empire unraveled. And of course, the end came in 1918, in the basement at Ekaterinburg. The children were told they were being moved. They dressed in their plainest clothes. Alexei, frail, had to be carried. And then, instead of a new palace, they faced executioners. It was a brutal end, one I won't linger on, since we're drifting into sleep. But what matters here is that all those careful years, the guarded games, the hushed voices around Alexei's illness, the long isolation of the sisters, ended not in crowns or marriages, but in silence. The Romanov children, fragile and cloistered, lived lives that were both protected and fatally exposed. They had everything, and nothing at all. So if you imagine yourself as a child in the Romanov palace, it might feel like this, layers of velvet and fur, but always a sense that your body could betray you. A world of tutors and prayers, but no friends outside your sisters. And the knowledge, however faint, that your life was tied to forces you could not control, illness, revolution, the mistakes of parents, and the whims of fate. Not exactly the winter fairy tale people imagine when they think of Russia's imperial children. Now, from the icy palaces of the Romanovs, where would you like me to drift next? I could carry us gently into the Habsburg children, with their famously inbred jaws and their heavy destinies. Or perhaps into the sad little Spanish infantes, many of whom never made it past infancy. The Habsburg children, born tired, born doomed. The Habsburgs. If you've ever seen a painting of a royal family where half the faces look like they've been gently squashed by a pastry press, you've probably met them already. This was the dynasty that controlled half of Europe, yet seemed incapable of producing children who weren't fragile, sickly, or, well, oddly shaped. The problem was simple: they married each other. Again and again. Cousins, nieces, uncles, occasionally an aunt if the paperwork worked out. generations of narrowing the family tree until it looked less like a tree and more like a single stubborn stalk. So let's see what that meant for their children. Take Charles II of Spain, often called El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. He was born in 1661, and he was the purest distillation of Habsburg inbreeding. His family tree showed more loops than a poorly tied shoelace. His father was also his great-uncle. His mother was his father's niece. That sort of thing. So what did childhood look like for Charles? Fragile doesn't begin to cover it. He didn't walk until he was 4. He didn't speak until he was nearly 8. He had one leg shorter than the other, a jaw so enlarged that he couldn't chew properly, and health so weak that everyone assumed he would die before adulthood. But, and here's the strange bit, he didn't. He lingered on. Sickly, slow, constantly under care, but alive. Which meant he eventually became king. A king who was functionally a child his whole life. His education was limited, because of course it was. Tutors were warned not to tire him. They avoided difficult lessons. He spent much of his time surrounded by priests, who encouraged his belief that he was cursed. And he came to believe it. He prayed endlessly, searching for deliverance, while the Spanish Empire collapsed around him. So, Charles's childhood, in short, too fragile to live, but doomed to reign anyway. Not exactly the dream of dynasty. And then there were the Austrian Habsburg children. Many of them suffered from milder versions of the same traits, the famous Habsburg jaw, weak chins, poor health, infertility. Imagine being a little archduke or archduchess in the Hofburg Palace. You're dressed in stiff little gowns, paraded for portraits, and constantly inspected for signs of weakness. Your teeth are crooked, your chin sticks out like a small shelf, and you're already being told who you will marry. Usually another cousin, equally tired-looking. One of the sadder examples is Maria Antonia of Austria, who married into Spain in the late 17th century. As a child, she was frail, often sick, and endlessly reminded that she was her family's best hope of keeping alliances alive. She grew up pampered yet unhealthy, and died at just 21, after years of miscarriages. Her entire childhood had been a preparation for marriage, and her body simply couldn't keep up with the expectations. What's striking about Habsburg children is how many of them didn't make it to adulthood at all. Infant mortality was high everywhere in Europe at the time, but in this dynasty, it was compounded by the genetic bottleneck. Babies were born weak, with immune systems that seemed barely functional. Some were born with hydrocephalus, others with deformities. And yet, each one was celebrated at birth with fireworks, masses, and proclamations, before quietly fading away in the nursery. It must have been unsettling, as a child, to watch siblings disappear one after another, while courtiers whispered that your blood was too thin to survive. And then, for those who did survive, there was the crushing weight of duty. If you were a boy, you were destined for the priesthood or the army. If you were a girl, you were destined for marriage into another court. None of this was negotiable. And your health, or lack of it, rarely excused you. Consider poor Marie Antoinette, the most famous Habsburg child of them all. Born in Vienna in 1755, she was the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa. By the time she was 10, she was already being groomed for a French marriage. Her childhood was filled with etiquette lessons, musical practice, and endless reminders that she represented her mother's ambitions. Did she get to choose her toys, her friends, her hobbies? Not really. Her tutors reported she was a bit lazy with her studies, which isn't surprising. When your future is sealed by age 12, it's hard to care much about Latin verbs. She was sent to France at 14, effectively still a child, to marry Louis XVI. Her childhood ended on the road to Versailles. So if you imagine yourself as a Habsburg child, it might feel like this: heavy clothes you can't move in, teeth that don't quite meet, constant illness, and the knowledge that your only purpose is to marry another cousin and continue the experiment. And naturally, you'd grow up watched by priests, doctors, and courtiers, all of whom were silently wondering whether you'd even live long enough to do it. It was less a childhood and more a breeding program. From the Habsburg nurseries, we could drift softly to another dynasty. Perhaps the Bourbons of France, where princes grew up pampered yet neglected, and dauphins were treated as living symbols rather than children. Or, if you prefer, we could meander into the Plantagenet airs of medieval England, where childhood was short and battles came early. If you picture childhood in Versailles, you might imagine little princes and princesses running through endless gardens, nibbling on pastries, and being adored by doting queens. In reality, the childhood of Bourbon heirs was less about warmth and more about spectacle. From the moment a royal baby was born in France, they weren't simply children. They were public property. Take the birth of a dauphin, the heir to the throne. The delivery happened in front of an audience. Not just doctors and midwives, but courtiers, bishops, ambassadors, and anyone important enough to squeeze into the room. Why? Because the monarchy needed witnesses, proof that the baby was real, legitimate, and not swapped for a healthier substitute. So, your very first moments of life, you're naked, crying, and immediately surrounded by 50 strangers judging whether you look Bourbon enough. Not exactly a gentle start. And once born, you weren't raised by your parents. That would be far too ordinary. Royal children were handed over to wet nurses, governesses, and tutors. They lived in their own apartments, carefully separated from the king and queen. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, famously said, "Princes are not raised to be loved, but to be useful." Which really sets the tone. So, childhood at Versailles wasn't about play. It was about performance. A dauphin's first steps, first words, even first teeth were reported like state news. When he sneezed, someone probably wrote it down. But this detached system also meant the children often grew up without much affection from their parents. Louis XIV, for example, fathered many children, legitimate and otherwise, but rarely spent real time with them. His legitimate son, the Grand Dauphin, was raised by attendants. He grew into a man who was famously passive, dull, and utterly unsuited to rule. People whispered that he had been softened by a loveless, ceremonial childhood. The Bourbon daughters fared no better. Most were married off abroad while still teenagers, sometimes to men decades older. They were raised to be bargaining chips, not individuals. Their childhoods were rehearsals for leaving home forever. And then there's the small matter of illness. The gilded halls of Versailles looked glamorous, but they were not hygienic. Courtiers packed in, perfumes masking unwashed bodies, stagnant fountains breeding disease. Childhood mortality was brutal. Louis XV, for instance, lost both of his parents to smallpox when he was just a toddler. He was suddenly the heir to the throne, raised almost entirely by courtiers, without the soft buffer of parental affection. His guardians treated him more like a fragile national treasure than a child. He grew up shy, awkward, and deeply uncomfortable with responsibility, traits that haunted his reign. And then, of course, we arrive at Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's children. The last Bourbon children before the Revolution swallowed the monarchy whole. Their eldest son, Louis Joseph, was frail from the start. Curly-haired, wide-eyed, but constantly ill. He suffered from tuberculosis of the spine, which left him in pain, struggling to walk. His parents adored him, perhaps unusually, compared to earlier generations, but no affection could save him. He died at age 7, while the revolution was already stirring in the streets. The second son, Louis Charles, became the tragic Louis XVII. After his father's execution, he was locked in a tower, alone, for years. Neglected, beaten, and left in filth, he died at just 10 years old. His body was covered in sores and scars when discovered. A Bourbon child reduced to less than nothing. Marie Antoinette's daughters had their own share of sorrow. Marie-Therese, the eldest, survived prison, but grew up haunted, brittle, and isolated, the last remnant of her family. Her childhood ended not with dolls and tutors, but with the sound of the guillotine blade. So, what did it mean to be a Bourbon child? It meant being born in public. Being raised by strangers. Being dressed, fed, and disciplined according to rigid rules. It meant being adored as symbols, but rarely cherished as people. And it often meant dying young, either from disease or from the fury of your subjects. A strange paradox, born into luxury, but deprived of the basic warmth and safety that most children would expect. If you imagine yourself as one of them, it would feel like this: silken sheets, but cold hands. Endless gardens outside your window, but little freedom to step into them. And the knowledge, even as a child, that your life wasn't really your own. It belonged to France. From Versailles, we could drift further into another royal nursery. Perhaps the Plantagenets and Tudors again, with their brutal early deaths and endless wars. Or we could wander to the Hanoverian children of Britain, many of whom grew up miserable under domineering fathers and meddling mothers. The Hanoverians arrived in Britain in 1714, when George I became king. He didn't even speak English. And from that moment onward, their family life was a public circus of arguments, scandals, and cold parenting. If you were born a child into this dynasty, you had status, yes, but don't expect much affection. Let's begin with George I's family. He famously loathed his own son, the future George II. The two had such a bitter relationship that George I once had his son arrested during a family quarrel. Naturally, this didn't make for a warm childhood for the grandchildren either. When George II finally became king, he repeated the pattern, despising his own heir. This became a kind of Hanoverian tradition, fathers and sons hating each other across generations. Which meant the royal children grew up as pawns in their parents' quarrels, pulled back and forth like pieces on a chessboard. Consider Frederick, Prince of Wales, son of George II. Poor Frederick was kept away from his parents for most of his childhood. He grew up in Hanover while his parents were in England. By the time he finally joined them, the distance was permanent. George II and Queen Caroline openly disliked him. As a child, Frederick learned early that he was unwanted. His parents called him the greatest ass, and the greatest liar, and the greatest canaille, and the greatest beast in the whole world. Imagine being 10 years old, hearing your parents describe you like that in public. Not exactly a loving nursery environment. Frederick tried to cultivate his own circle, his own family life when he grew older, but even his children were used as pawns in the endless Hanoverian cycle of bitterness. Then we come to George III's children. George III, remembered for his later bouts of madness, had 15 children. Yes, 15. You might imagine this meant a bustling, cheerful nursery. In reality, it was closer to a regimented barracks. George was a devoted father, but in an overbearing, suffocating way. He set strict rules. His daughters, in particular, were kept on such tight leashes that most of them never married. They were raised like nuns, cloistered in the palace, watched constantly. By adulthood, many of them were deeply unhappy, nervous, and dependent on their parents. The sons didn't fare much better. George's strictness, combined with his mental decline, left them resentful. Several of his sons rebelled, plunging into gambling, drinking, and scandalous affairs. They had been raised with constant lectures and punishments, and once free, they dove headlong into chaos. One of the most tragic examples was Princess Amelia, George III's youngest daughter. As a child, she was affectionate, playful, and full of life. But she was also frail, suffering from tuberculosis and other ailments. George doted on her, perhaps more than the others, but his suffocating love became a burden. Amelia spent much of her short life confined, watched, treated as fragile porcelain. She died at just 27, leaving George devastated. He is said to have broken completely after her death, his madness spiraling beyond repair. And then, of course, there's George IV, the son raised under the system. His childhood was full of pomp and no real affection. His father lectured him, restricted him, scolded him. So naturally, when he became an adult, he rebelled in the loudest way possible. Extravagant clothes, endless debts, mistresses, secret marriages. His childhood discipline produced not virtue, but vice. Even Queen Victoria, later on, would reflect on this cycle of Hanoverian dysfunction. She observed how cold, strict, and joyless the upbringing of royal children had been, and resolved to do better with her own. Though whether she succeeded is debatable, but that's for another part. So, what did it mean to be a Hanoverian child? It meant being born into a family where love was rationed, where fathers distrusted sons, and where mothers kept daughters locked away. It meant growing up in palaces that felt more like prisons, surrounded by wealth but starved of tenderness. Your destiny was fixed, your freedom limited, and your private pain very, very public. If you close your eyes and imagine it, the sound of coaches on gravel outside Windsor, the stiff uniforms of tutors and nannies, the ever-present sense that your father disapproved of you, even when you did nothing wrong. That was a Hanoverian childhood. Now, we could drift next into the children of Queen Victoria herself, since she presided over an enormous brood whose lives became the tangled web of European royalty. Or, if you'd like a darker turn, we could meander back into the medieval Plantagenet heirs, where childhood meant being trained for war by age 7. When Queen Victoria and Prince Albert married, they set out with great enthusiasm to build what they called a model family. Not just a royal household, but a shining example of virtue, discipline, and order. 9 children followed in quick succession, each one another pawn in the great game of dynastic alliances. At first glance, you might think these children were lucky. They grew up in Windsor and Osborne House, surrounded by tutors, toys, and sprawling estates. They were photographed endlessly, dressed in little sailor suits, posed as the very picture of domestic bliss. But behind the sentimental portraits, childhood in Victoria's household was far from gentle. Victoria herself had little patience for actual children. She adored babies, plump, doll-like, quiet. But once they grew into noisy toddlers with opinions of their own, she quickly lost interest. She wrote openly in her journals that she disliked being around young children, calling them frog-like and tiresome. Albert, on the other hand, adored planning their education. He designed strict timetables, mapped out lessons in languages, history, and religion. He wanted to shape them into disciplined, useful adults, no idle heirs here. So the nursery became more like a training academy. Even playtime was structured, with outdoor walks scheduled like military drills. Let's look at a few of these children in turn. The eldest, Victoria, Princess Royal, known as Vicky. She was bright, quick, and deeply attached to her father. Albert doted on her, praised her intelligence, and she thrived under his attention. But when she was just 17, she was married off to the future German Kaiser, Wilhelm I's son. Suddenly, she was transplanted into the Prussian court, where her English upbringing and liberal ideas clashed with rigid German conservatism. Her childhood closeness with Albert left her unprepared for the coldness she found abroad. Then there was Bertie, the future Edward VII. From the beginning, Bertie disappointed his parents. He was slow with his studies, easily distracted, fond of gossip and mischief. Albert, in particular, scolded him constantly, seeing him as lazy and shallow. Victoria herself called him stupid. The poor boy grew up under the shadow of endless disapproval. By adulthood, he responded the only way he knew how, by rebelling. Mistresses, gambling, heavy eating, and drinking. His miserable childhood discipline did not produce the upright king his parents dreamed of. Instead, it produced one of the most flamboyant playboys of the 19th century. Then came Alice, gentle and kind, often described as the most tender-hearted of Victoria's brood. As a child, she was the peacemaker, the one who soothed quarrels. She grew up deeply compassionate, but her childhood closeness to her mother also made her Victoria's emotional crutch. When Albert died, Victoria leaned heavily on Alice, even though Alice was still very young herself. That burden marked her adulthood. She married into the Hessian court and spent much of her short life caring for her sickly children, one of whom inherited hemophilia. She died young, at 35, of diphtheria, worn out by a life of service that began in childhood. Alfred, the second son, was less scrutinized. He was sent into the Navy, partly to keep him occupied, partly because his parents had little expectation for him. He grew up largely out of the spotlight, but even he was not free of pressure. He eventually inherited the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, but by then his health was failing, a reminder that even quieter childhoods didn't mean happier ones. Perhaps the saddest was Leopold, born with hemophilia. From his earliest days, his childhood was wrapped in restrictions. No rough play, no risky outings, constant supervision. Victoria, who had little patience for weakness, struggled with him. And Leopold, intelligent and sensitive, grew up frustrated by his confinement. He longed for freedom, but his body betrayed him. He died young, at just 30, after a fall triggered a fatal bleed. His fragile childhood was simply a prelude to an early end. Through it all, Victoria herself loomed like a storm cloud over the nursery. She demanded obedience, judged her children harshly, and rarely showed warmth. Letters from the children reveal a constant hunger for approval, a sense that nothing they did was ever enough. The irony is that Victoria projected to the world the image of a perfect family, cozy domesticity, moral strength, an antidote to the scandals of earlier monarchs. But her children's reality was pressure, duty, and distance. What did it mean to be a child of Queen Victoria? It meant having a timetable instead of a childhood. A mother who preferred you as a baby but scolded you as a person. A father whose discipline felt more like an exam you were always failing. And it meant knowing that, whatever your own wishes, your life would be spent marrying abroad, managing appearances, and continuing the dynasty. It was less a family, more a factory, one producing heirs, alliances, and carefully curated portraits for public consumption. If you imagine it for yourself, the sound of Albert's pen scratching out another timetable, the sharp voice of Victoria reminding you not to slouch, the weight of lessons pressing down on your day, and the knowledge that affection was always conditional. That was a Victorian royal childhood. From here, we might wander into the Roman children of the Caesars, raised with daggers and poison always close at hand. Or we could drift to the medieval French royal nursery, where saints and swords shaped even the youngest heirs.